All right, here is the project. I want to mount an Apple TV to the underside of a kitchen cabinet. Sure, I could probably buy an Apple TV mount off of Amazon, but where is the fun in that? So this video is retracing the steps that I took to design an Apple TV mount and ultimately trying to show you the tools that you can use to create any project that you want to design. All right, so let's see how we did. Let's go.
So in creating this mount, I can basically break this project up into three parts. Part one, creating an Apple TV cutout. Part two was designing a container that actually fits around the Apple TV. Part three was designing a mount that would allow the mounting of this container to the underside of this cabinet. Now for part one, creating the Apple TV cutout, there were some design elements that I wanted to make sure I addressed. I wanted to create a container for the Apple TV that would essentially wrap around the body of this Apple TV unit. Now, it's an older Apple TV. It's a 4K unit, but I wanted to use this with a small TV that was mounted underneath a kitchen cabinet. So for this project, I needed to create an Apple TV replica in Tinkercad that I could build around. The most obvious place to start was with a box and using those radius settings to create those nice rounded corners. Eyeballing the shape of the corners was not enough if I wanted to create a snug fit around the Apple TV. So to help guide me, I opted to take an image of an Apple TV of the same model, convert it into an SVG by importing it into picsvg.com. The website is relatively straightforward to use. Once you've uploaded your image, you do have some options there regarding the detail and the types of filters, but I'll include a link to a video that goes into this in some more detail at the end of this video. Then I downloaded it and then uploaded it into Tinkercad. Now, the ability to import images into Tinkercad can serve many different purposes beyond just creating templates, so be sure to check it out. Now, one thing, you just had to make sure that you imported it as art. Again, this was a relatively easy step, and this is what it looked like. This would then serve as a sort of template as I created my Apple TV replica and paying particular attention to those curves around those corners of my Apple TV. Now, the SVG was not of the right size after I imported it into Tinkercad, but I'm going to resize it later, so no problem. I just needed to either measure the dimensions of the Apple TV or find the correct dimensions of the Apple TV. Now, for this particular model of the Apple TV, it was 98 millimeters wide, 98 millimeters deep, and 35 millimeters tall. So again, focusing specifically on those corners of the Apple TV, I just wanted to correctly size the length and the width of the imported SVG with the measurements of my replica TV. I sized both the SVG template and my Apple TV replica so that they both had the same shared length of 98 millimeters. Now, I had to be aware that the SVG also included other details from the original imported image that were not part of the Apple TV. So these outside details became part of the dimensions of this SVG and not correct. So in this case, the dimensions of width along the x-axis were impacted. So I had to use the dimension of depth instead, which was the measurement along the y-axis. In this case, pressing and holding the shift button as I pressed on one of the white grab points ensured that resizing the one dimension would also resize the other dimension, in this case, the width along the x-axis, proportionally. I also did this for the Apple TV replica. I just needed to press and hold shift as I clicked on one of those grab points, and then entering in 98 millimeters, the other dimensions resized themselves accordingly. Now, with both my Apple TV replica and SVG template at the right size in both the length and the width, I just aligned them together using the alignment tool. I really focused on aligning them along the edges rather than the center points. And then selecting on my Apple TV replica, I used the radius slider on the side menu and then adjusted the rounded corner of my Apple TV replica until it matched the template as close as possible. Once that was done, I could discard the SVG template and focus on completing the rest of the Apple TV replica. It was here that I had to square off the top and the bottom. Again, taking a box, converting it into a hole, and applying it from the top and the bottom of my soon-to-be Apple TV replica gave me the nice squared top and bottom edges I was looking for. Finally, I just had to ensure that the height of the Apple TV replica was set at the correct 35 millimeters. And there it was. This was my replica of the Apple TV. The last thing I had to do was convert this into a hole so it could serve as essentially an Apple TV cutout. Now, another note here, in creating an effective cutout, especially with the intent that you want to print this out, I also had to make the dimensions of my Apple TV hole slightly larger in order to account for the tendency for filament to expand slightly as it is being extruded in layers. This results in 3D objects that are slightly larger, or consequently holes that are slightly smaller than intended. So for my design, I wanted a good fit for the Apple TV, but with enough wiggle room so that the Apple TV could be inserted or removed from the mount with ease. So for me, I added a couple of millimeters to the depth, the width, as well as the height. So basically 100 millimeters by 100 millimeters and a height of 37 millimeters. Now with this Apple TV replica cutout ready, it was time to make the container. So part 2 is all about designing a custom container that provided a snug and secure fit to the Apple TV. So in order to create this container, I just basically took a duplicate of the Apple TV cutout hole and turned it into a solid. After that, I then increased the depth and the width by 8 millimeters so that I would be left with 4 millimeters of wall thickness on either side once I aligned them by their center along the X and Y axis using the alignment tool. After that, I also added 4 millimeters of additional height to give a floor thickness of 4 millimeters once I aligned them both to the top surface along the Z axis. So again, here's a quick overview of the changes I made to the dimensions of this Apple TV container. Next, I just grouped them. Once this container was made, some of the design elements that I now had to incorporate into this were the openings for easy access to the ports on the back of the Apple TV. And this was simply accomplished by duplicating the Apple TV hole and then extending it out of the container and then regrouping them together. This would essentially cut out the perfectly sized hole that would allow me to move the Apple TV in and out of this Apple TV container. I also had to ensure that there were openings to view the operating light at the front of the Apple TV. I also found out that there was an IR sensor on the front of the Apple TV, so I needed to ensure that it was not blocked. A simple box-shaped hole with the right dimensions that would allow for the light and the IR sensor to be uncovered was basically inserted to punch a hole through the front wall of this container. Again, using the alignment tool as well as the group tool were very important. Now, another design element was around the cooling of this unit. This was important. This Apple TV has vents located at the base that allows for the unit to cool itself. It was here that I decided to have the Apple TV sit upside down. That way I could have the hot air naturally vent upward as long as I had openings at the top to allow that to happen. This decision also allowed me to add the feature that would help hold the Apple TV in the container and prevent it from sliding out. The top surface of the Apple TV was completely flat and would make it very easy for me to have an angled tab that would allow me to click the Apple TV into place once it was properly seated inside of the container and then prevent it from sliding out. This tab then had to be somewhat flexible, and I accomplished this by taking 2 long box-shaped holes and cutting into the base of the container. This would ideally allow for the resulting plastic tab to be able to flex when the Apple TV moved into place, and consequently allow me to move the tab downward if I ever wanted to release the Apple TV from the container. All right, so I just sped up the footage here a little bit, but I have been using the workplane tool a lot because just being able to throw down this workplane tool on any surface of this object and then being able to drop other objects onto that surface has been such a helpful tool to have, especially as I create this extended tab that comes out from the base of my Apple TV and being able to throw down an angled piece that will then allow the Apple TV to slide in, but then click behind it so it doesn't slide out. The workplane tool. An awesome tool. All right, looks good. Now, finishing off the top of the container, I opted to go with guide rails rather than a solid top. Again, this was to ensure that there would be proper ventilation for the now inverted Apple TV and having the hot air come up and out of the unit. I also made the rails from a portion of a box that had rounded corners using the radius setting. And then I dragged the shape out to help flatten this curve somewhat and make it more gradual. So hopefully it was something that would guide the Apple TV unit in as it was being inserted into the container. So using my Apple TV cutout as a guide here, I just simply use the workplane tool to rest these guide rails at the appropriate height for the Apple TV. Once I got the design right for one of the guide rails, I just needed to duplicate it, separate it out, group it, and then center it to the Apple TV container. Nice. Now, with the guide rails in place, it added to the height of this Apple TV container. I needed to then extend the walls of this Apple TV container so that it was flush with the tops of those guide rails. Now, simply stretching the Apple TV container upward to sit flush with the tops of those guide rails was not going to work because it would also stretch the floor of the Apple TV container as well, and then change the dimensions of that slot that the Apple TV was going to sit, and run the risk of this Apple TV no longer being able to fit inside of this container. So I just basically had to duplicate the Apple TV container and just take away the top edge of that Apple TV container wall so that I could then add it to the existing Apple TV container and bring it flush to the tops of those guide rails. So a few additional steps here, but I had to preserve that space for the Apple TV to fit properly inside of this unit. Not sure how everybody else would have done this, but that was the way I did this. All right, part 3. So I've got the container for my Apple TV done. Now it was figuring out how I was going to mount this on the underside of that cabinet. Now this had some specific design elements to consider as well, because I wanted this mount to fit over top of an existing mounting plate for a TV mount that was already there. So essentially, I was going to have this Apple TV mount straddle the existing mounting plate for that TV. So I had to measure the width of the existing mount plate as well as the thickness of the mount plate, including the bolt heads that held that mount plate to the underside of the cabinet. I had to factor all of this in order to create enough space so that my Apple TV mount could be placed over top of this existing mount. So I had to make the plate wide enough to accommodate this cutout for the pre-existing mount plate and the bolts, while also providing ample space for its own mounting screws. I also wanted to create pilot holes for the screws that were countersunk into the base of the Apple TV mount as well, just to make it look good. Now, in order to do this, I accomplished this with a few cylinder shapes that match the diameter of the screw as well as the screw head, and then an additional cone-shaped hole that would help in creating that contoured hole that would help fit the angled base of that screw head. Then it was just a matter of aligning them together and then placing them strategically along the sides of the Apple TV mount, basically 2 per side. I just love being able to add little details like this to any design. Look at that. Looks good. To help ensure that the Apple TV could properly vent, rather than going with a solid base, I also added a large hole to the center of that Apple TV mount. Again, it would just allow the hot air to simply empty into that cutout space. However, to add to the complexity of this Apple TV mount, it also had to allow for the rotational movement of the arm that held that TV panel. If I didn't do this, this would actually limit how much I could rotate that screen, and you'd end up having that arm bumping into the Apple TV mount. So I opted to extend a cutout from the hole of the base plate towards the edge that would be potentially rubbing up against this rotating TV arm. Problem solved. So I've been talking a lot about grouping, the alignment tool, the workplane tool. I gotta throw in here the use of the ruler. and it really does come in handy once you get the hang of it. But for this particular situation, I needed to align this hole so that it started at the center point of the circle there in the middle of my base plate. And because I knew the dimensions of the circle and where it stood in that base plate, the ruler really comes in handy here because I can set that hole exactly where I want it to start and create this seamless cutout in my base plate. For those that might need it, I will include a link about how to use the ruler tool at the end of this video. Now, when bringing the Apple TV container together with this mount, I also had to rotate the container 90 degrees so that the Apple TV would now have to load from the side rather than from the back. Unfortunately, there was just not enough depth underneath that cabinet to allow for the Apple TV to be inserted from behind. Ultimately, not a huge deal, but ideally, I was kind of hoping to have that indicator light facing forward. So putting them both together and looking at this finished product, printing it up as one piece was certainly an option, but it would result in a lot of filament being wasted to produce supports for this print. So I decided to print this up as two pieces and then glue them together. I won't get into it here, but I had to create an embedded footprint of that container into the base in order for those two pieces to come together nicely and provide some good surface area between the two pieces for the glue to do its work. So to the printer we go. The container, and then the base. Then it was just a matter of checking to see if the Apple TV fit in nicely into the container, and it did. Slid in no problem, and the locking mechanism worked like a charm. It did not want to come out on its own. Next, it was time to install the Apple TV mount. Drilled in some pilot holes into the base of the cabinet, and then fastened it to the base of that cabinet using the screws. The arm swiveled nicely, did not bump into the Apple TV base at all. Final check, Apple TV slides in nicely. Look at that, I can totally see the indicator light. Listen, I am not going to win any awards with this design, but what I love about this is that I can design my own things using Tinkercad and then printing it up and create things that I cannot get anywhere else that serve my specific needs and my specific criteria for design. Just know that anyone can do this. If I can do this, you can do this. Anyways, I hope you found that interesting. Until next time, we'll see you later.